Hey, welcome to another episode of the Lutheran Worship Podcast, brought to you by the Center for Worship Leadership at Concordia University, Irvine. I am Steve Zank, joined by my friend Kip Fox. Kip, good to see you today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm getting ready for our annual Songwriter Initiative retreat in California next week with 60 writers from our Lutheran churches, 20 states. Everybody's coming into town, so I'm feeling good. I'm feeling fresh. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited for the event here next week, and the theologians being involved, the songwriters being involved, the professional songwriters, participants, the sharing, the camaraderie. It's a really special event, and I'm excited. Kip, thanks for putting all that on for us.
Yeah.
That guitar behind you, by the way, it's not for decoration. You play it.
I play it. I can do it.
Yeah. And that's sort of what we're talking about a little bit here today, is the relationship between practice and theology and practice. And this conversation is coming around again. It's an important conversation that's been around in Lutheranism and beyond for a long time. And there was a book by a gentleman named David Lukey. It was very popular, called Evangelical Style, Lutheran Substance. And it really kicked off a bit of a controversy and dialogue about, well, what is the relationship between style and substance, or practice and theology? What is that relationship? And ever since that book, before that book, and into today's conversations, Lutherans and others are very interested in what exactly is the relationship between theology and practice. And there's a lot of different avenues for this conversation, but some people will say, for example, all that matters is that in Lutheranism and in our denomination, Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, all that really matters is we have a confessional agreement, that we agree to the confessions, and then our practice can be kind of anything. That's one approach. And others will come into the conversation and say, well, gosh, doesn't our theology inform our practice? Isn't there a way in which some practices will be out of alignment with our theology? It's that relationship is a really important one. Kip, have you experienced that conversation at all in any of your contexts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been in a few churches in my time as director of parish music, and that is certainly always a conversation. I think especially being involved as a DPM who has done modern worship music, contemporary worship music, we're having these conversations on how we practice our theology and how our, in a more literal way, how our liturgy is formed and shaped on Sunday mornings. And so, yeah, we wrestle with those things all the time.
And this is going to be a multi-part series. It's going to be broken up because next week we're really excited to share with you a live episode from the Songwriter Initiative retreat. So we're going to do that and kind of break up some of this. But we're going to start today still laying the groundwork of the conversation. How does doctrine and practice relate? And we're going to use the work of a Methodist named Dwight Vogel, who taught at Garrett Seminary. And he has a few categories that I think help us get into the conversation of the relationship between doctrine and practice. And so Vogel gives us 6 aspects of the relationship between theology and practice, 6 of them. The first is the theology of worship, the theology of our practices. The second is liturgy as theology, so our practices as a way of doing theology. Third, he talks about the theology of liturgy, or the theology of our practices. Fourth, talks about theology in liturgy, or theology in our practices. Fifth, theology because of liturgy, or theology because of our practices. And last, liturgy in life, our practices and life. And so what I'd like to do is go through those 6 aspects of the relationship and kind of set the stage for really how dynamic this conversation is going to be. And then we'll be getting into, in the future, maxims like lex orandi, lex credendi, and discussing the importance of this relationship. One thing I want to say out the gate is that here at the Center for Worship Leadership, we know and believe and agree there's a very important connection between theology and practice. There was a recent publication that suggested that maybe we didn't think that. And so I just want to go on the record to say that is very important to us here. So let's get into it. This first one that Vogel puts forward is the idea that there's a theology of worship. That is, there's a theology that informs all of our practices, what's going on in our practices. And so this is an important question, and it's a kind of a question for me. It goes back to that old analogy of a thick and a thin description, right? So a thin description are the things you observe, like a wink. We talked about that before. And the thick description is what's actually going on. So we think about the theology of our practices. What we're thinking about is what's actually going on. What's the theology of worship? And so you can imagine, Kip, knowing what's actually going on is going to affect what kind of practices you observe. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. The first thing that comes to mind for me, and again, I often think through the lens of songs or song selection, as we practice the sacrament of the Lord's Supper, even though a pastor may explain that every week or in some way, then that can oftentimes, people may not be paying attention or that may be rote. I think that oftentimes our song selection during that time can really send mixed messages and confuse folks. I've seen it where there are different messages being sent through the music and through the lyrics of a song during Holy Communion that go against our theology. And it may seem harmless, but over time, as we understand and as our people are trying to understand or conceive of what our very unique and awesome theology is on the Lord's Supper, you see how that can really deter someone or keep someone from receiving really the blessing that is Holy Communion.
That's a really good one to think about. So our theology of that practice is that we gather around the Lord's table to receive the body and blood of Jesus for the forgiveness of sins.
Mm-hmm.
And that's our theology. And that's interesting. So I've had that same experience where a lot of songs are about my response, my work.
Mm-hmm.
It feels like a mismatch with the theology of worship in that moment.
Yeah.
That's a great example. So so that's one really important way that theology and practice relate, is that there's a theology that informs what kind of practices are going to actually do the thing that we were saying we're doing. And Lutherans have a distinct theology from other denominations and other brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ, but we still have a distinct theology, and we're proud of it, and we love it, and it serves us well. Okay, so then Vogel gives us this other category, which is liturgy as theology, practices as theology. Now, Vogel talks about, he's discussing liturgical theology in a way, which is a whole movement around several important figures, including like David Fagerberg is Roman Catholic. It follows the work of Aidan Kavanaugh and Alexander Schmemann. And what they're working on is the idea of theology is primarily done in liturgy. So theology is not something over here that's studied in a book, or that's secondary theology, but primary theology is done in the liturgy, in practices. And there's a famous person that this company has used, which is Mrs. Murphy. And Mrs. Murphy's in the pew, and Mrs. Murphy is the kind of the primary theologian because she's invested and involved in the liturgy where the theology is happening. So this one, I would think he's drawing out this idea that our practices are theology, that this is what we're doing. And so as Lutherans, there's a lot here to discuss, and we're going to get into this particular aspect more in the future when we discuss lex orandi, lex credendi. But needless to say, one of the ways that doctrine and practice might relate is that practices might be one of the most important places theology is done. And we can debate that and discuss that. And for some people, this means actually something very specific, which is liturgy is a source of theology. Mm-hmm. So we'll get into that again in a future episode. But the idea is the liturgy is actually becomes, as the great tradition one of the formal principles of theology, which means it's one of the sources that we get our theology from, and not just scripture. You see, so it's a very Roman Catholic thought, which Lutherans say sola scriptura in this way. The Roman Catholic Church has other sources of theology, including liturgy. So liturgy as theology sometimes has that shade to it. And we'll get into that later. So the next aspect he mentions is theology of liturgy. For our sake today, and kind of for the surface level we're going into, I'm going to lump that into theology of worship. And there's going to be a distinct meaning there, but we're just not going to go into it today, if that's okay, because we're doing a thumbnail sketch here, and this is just using it for a helpful way to start off this conversation. Vogel's fourth category is theology in liturgy. And this is a really important aspect of the relationship between theology and practice. And what he's saying is that there is theology in our practices. It's not just evangelical style Lutheran substance. It's that you can't separate the substance and the style. The practices themselves contain theology. And this is one of the great insights of the book done by Lester Ruth and Lim Swee Hong, is this idea that the contemporary praise and worship movement wasn't just one of practicality. We want to do this music, we just want to do this style, but they show in that book that that whole movement is driven by a theology, and that those practices embody a theology. And so here we have one of the most important relationships between theology and practice, which is our practices actually have theology in them. What do you think about that one, Kip?
Yeah, I mean, that's a slam dunk for us. I think that's why, we as a church body care so deeply about the different elements of our liturgy, and because we understand very clearly that what is contained within them is giving us our theology.
Yeah, so for example, the service of the word is going to be doing something. There's a theology behind it. The rites and rituals and the practices and the rubrics that are in a hymnal are all really intentionally designed theologically. They're trying to do something theologically. And sometimes I think the conversation about theology and practice breaks down when we stop attending to this. And sometimes Lutherans will just say, well, we have freedom in worship, so we can do anything we want to do. Well, our practices, there's theology in them.
Right.
This is really one of the most important things about the Songwriter Initiative and the way it functions, is that you guys are putting Lutheran theology into songs, because we acknowledge that the practices are carrying theology.
Yeah, and all of that out of a care for people's souls, to write with our Lutheran theology at the forefront in a way that reaches multiple contexts, knowing that we have this beautiful theology that sets people free and that points people to Jesus. And really, we just want the whole impetus behind what we're doing is to share that beautiful message with songs and sounds and rhythms and harmonies of our day. So, it's a big one for us.
There's theology in our practices. One of the things I think about a lot is some churches who do the classic 3-song set up front. Now, please hear me correctly. Walther's service had a similar feel to it in terms of it had several songs at the beginning. But I think we want to be careful as churches not to just adopt that liturgical practice. Let's just do 3 songs up front, and then we don't attend to the theology in that practice. Like Walther did in his 3 songs. We just grab 3 songs that we think are good and put them up front, and we forgot that there's actually a theology in that practice. And for Pentecostal churches, or certain churches that have a theology that they're trying to create a worshipful moment by our exuberance, by our participation in praise, and the 3 songs are designed theologically to create an environment where exuberance and praise can grow. We can't just grab that practice and throw it in front of our services. We can do 3 songs at the front. Like I said, Walther did a very similar thing. But we got to attend to the fact that we need to be watching for the theology that we're putting into those practices. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think about how there's so much life and care and attention given to the construction of our different settings of the divine service. And I think in both on both ends of the spectrum, you can have churches in practice just throwing out all these elements, just thinking they're not important. At the same time, you can have on the other side of the coin folks following by rote these our settings without an aliveness or a liveliness to them, without explaining them, without without weekly and monthly and annually helping people understand the richness of what's going on, instead of just like, this is what we do because this is in the book.
That's a great point, Kip. There's a way in which I think that we need to teach people our practices and the theology behind them, because they're not always as obvious as we think.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
great churches explain the liturgy that they're using and the theology in it. Mm-hmm. Okay, the last two aspects of the relationship between theology and practice that Vogel brings up are now more into the life of the person. So what's going on with the person who's attending these services, who's engaging in these practices? What's going on with their theology? And so the next one, the fifth category, is theology because liturgy. And so this one really acknowledges the fact that a liturgy, our practices, actually will instill theology in people. And I see it here at the university all the time. Students that have engaged a certain kind of service their whole life will have a certain kind of theological perspective. And a student who has a different kind of liturgy they've had their whole life will have a different theological perspective. And basically the practices that we do week after week as a church will inform a person's theology, and by that I mean their own belief system.
Yeah, and I think on the other side of the coin, we've got Lutheran churches all over in practice looking and sounding exactly like a church down the street with a completely different theology. And so, we have to examine ourselves as well and understand where that line is and what we're comfortable with, and make sure that we're making choices with intention, as always. And there may be good reasons, like you said, to start your service with a 3-song set. Okay, but why are we doing that? Where are we balancing out our practice here on a weekly basis with this service? What is the intention, and how are we framing that within our Lutheran theology?
And in a lot of ways, this fifth aspect tells us why this is all important. Why is the relationship between theology and practice so important? Well, yeah, one is we want to be faithful to God. I mean, God is the one who's given us the pattern of worship. He's given us the word and the sacrament, and He's given us a way that we don't get to make up the way we relate to Him. I mean, He's setting up the conversation, we're responding, and this is, there's a part of that's the main thing that's going on here. But in a secondary and very important aspect is that our liturgy, our practices are shaping people's belief systems. And that is why it's so important about what kind of theology is in our worship, because that theology in our worship makes its way into our congregation and into the way they think about God and their piety and the way that they deal with relationships and life and death and community and everything. Liturgy has an important role in the practices we do. So this fifth aspect really practices that we have a theology because of practices is incredibly important. And actually, this aspect I've heard people talk about before. I think it's more nuanced than this, but there are some people, for example, who are worried that if we take on certain practices that are different from our hymnal practices, that eventually the people who are getting this, a band and screens and this approach, this kind of aesthetic approach, will eventually say the Lutherans aren't doing this aesthetic approach very well. I'm going to go to the big box church across the street instead. That probably won't happen if we're attending to the theology that's in our worship and our practices. So that's why it's so important. Yes, we shouldn't do Pentecostal theology in Lutheran worship, but we can use songs written by that group in a Lutheran context, in a Lutheran way, attending to the theology in our practices. All right, last but not least, Kip, and then we'll call a close to this episode, Vogel points out that there's a deep relationship between practices and everyday life. And some people call this lex orandi, lex vivendi in Latin, the practices in life. So the idea here is the attitudes that we practice, the way that we do life together in liturgy will inform the way we do life together on Monday, on Tuesday, on Wednesday. There are scholars like Dr. Jim Marriott who's done work on this. He has an article in Lutheran Mission Matters, a couple of them, I think, on the idea of these liturgical behaviors. And for him, he thinks about things like in liturgy, in our practices, we practice reconciliation through confession and absolution. And that helps us, we go to the Lord's Supper also, we're encouraged to pass the peace and to have a reconciliation. And that's a liturgical behavior. And so when we go through our life Monday through Saturday, having done that in our practice encourages us to live a life of reconciliation. And there's others that can be identified, like hospitality, those kinds of things. So the kind of life we embody when we gather in our practice is informing the kind of life we live in our communities. And that's one of the reasons why the relationship between doctrine and practice is so important.
Yeah, it reminds me of the parable of the unforgiving servant, and certainly there are other ways in which our practices inform our daily life, but we have such a beautiful theology. It helps us to, with our families, with our loved ones, reflect that when we're getting a weekly diet of that absolution, of that forgiveness, of that mercy. It changes the way we see the world. It changes the way that we interact with not only our close neighbors, but the way that we read the news and the way that we view different leaders in our communities and different mistakes that are made and all those things. We start to understand and have a compassion for the humanity around us, and which is just, again, one of the ways in which our practices inform our daily life.
There's a great talk from Wally a couple years back that we'll link up here that you can watch from Dr. Zach Hicks about worship as a gymnasium or gymnasium. And he kind of one of the examples he brought up in that was the idea of what we pray on Sunday is teaching us how to pray in our regular lives. And so he was encouraging our group, like, for example, when we see a tragedy in our nation, what's our first response? What's our gut response? What do we do? And one of the things he encourages us in is, if we're used to a life of prayer that brings these things to God in prayer, we practice that on Sunday and encourage that as a way of responding, then even in our regular life, we see a national tragedy, we might actually find ourselves on our knees praying for it and for our community first. And that might be inculcated in us because when we design our services and think about what we pray, we are actually attending to the relationship between doctrine and practice. And that will actually then help us understand our practices on Monday and Tuesday.
Yeah, it just reminds me, in past years of major news events that happen, tragedies or election cycles or this or that. And it's, in a funny way, often going to church and going, how is the pastor going to pray about this particular thing?
Yeah.
And it really is it's a very, I know for pastors, it's a very heavy weight to go, what am I going to say about this? What is the prayer today?
Yeah.
Everybody coming has a different idea of what they should and want to be praying. And the pastor gets to inform them with his prayer. This is how we are coming to God with this situation.
Yeah. And the other thing I think about, Kip, in this area is even like our affect or our feelings. Like, is worship a joy? Is there an aspect of joy there as a community? And some of the most joyful people I've met in my life, they were just so joyful in worship, in the practices, the songs of joy. And then after service, have a big smile on their face and they say, hey, do you want to come over for lunch today after service? And I think there's a way in which sometimes too, we want to, reverence, confession and honesty about sorrow. Yes. and joy. And I
Mhm.
think sometimes that's also a part of the relationship between doctrine and practice, is that our doctrine of justification, that on account of Christ, that we are God's children, and that's a great joy and a great relief in our life, and that He loves us and cares for us, and we have each other and all the gifts that those doctrines give us, this practice of joy, and that even leads us back into joy in our lives, the way we think about our life on Monday. So yeah, I think, Kip, this is going to be a really fun series on the relationship between doctrine and practice. It's timely. We're going to get into some more aspects of this. I'm excited to get into lex orandi, lex credendi, and talk more about that. Listeners, a couple of just brief announcements. First is, if you've been waiting for the rest of the NAR series, we've had some emails about that. We have a third host we're going to bring on for that conversation, who had a sudden illness, and so we're waiting for him for his recovery. But we're going to get back to that conversation, so thanks for waiting with us. And the second is then looking forward to next week for a little bit of a taste of the Songwriter Retreat, a little special podcast episode from there, and then we'll get back into this relationship between belief and practice. Kip, any closing comments?
This was a great time, Steve.
I got a great time too, Kip. It's always good to see you. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lutheran Worship Podcast. We'll see you next time.